cars have not gotten any younger. Some of them are 60 years old, 70 years old, even 80-year-old cars we have on the racetrack. So we'll start. We're going to go through the tech sheet. That's the simplest form we'll go. If we want to follow it, fine. Most of these guys, Mr. Gellis has probably signed many of them over the years. But we'll go through it as a simple outline. But we can start with just a lousy frame section to a 60-year-old car that had a master cylinder mounted to the side of it with a bolt that was way too long. When you push the brake pedal, all it did is deflect. Many problems with it. One of them is a sleeve, simple sleeve, supposed to be inside the frame rail. You tighten the bolt, the frame doesn't crush. The master cylinder stays in place. Now when you push the brake pedal, it's not deflecting over. It exerts all its force into the master cylinder. One of the reasons on the tech sheets, it asks brake pedal pressure. Well, there's more to it. Linkage. Linkage that's sloppy, moving all around. Holes that are worn out. Bent. Again, force is not being applied as it should be to the master cylinder or master cylinders. Your leg can generate a good amount of force. A 10-inch pedal with a 1-inch fulcrum, that's 1,000 pounds with 100 pounds of force being applied into it. If you lose it along the line, that's less braking force you're going to have. The frames, also suspension pickups are welded to them. Austin Healey's in particular, 104s, are known to crack and have cracked multiple times at the suspension pickups on Dunlop tires. I won't get into the whole discussion of Dunlop tires, and we're going to stick with Dunlops. That's all I got to say. So the suspension pickups, frames that are old, roll bars or just roll bars. We're not using them to reinforce the cars in any way, but they should at least meet the standards. Most of them, if you look at on the false grid, take a good look at the cars. And the cars, it speaks for yourself. When the helmet is below the helmet, if the helmet is below the roll bar, that's great, but it's 2-inch minimum requirement, and not all the cars meet that. We should bring them up to standard. Some people say 3 inches. Your belts will stretch, and they stretch, and that's a whole nother argument. About 2 months ago, I received a phone call from somebody trying to get into I don't know if he was going to do VSCCA events, wants to do vintage racing. He goes, Pat, how do I put belts on a car? I said, well, there's a million ways not to put them in a car, because that's usually, they're not done right, is the angle. You got to look, every manufacturer, they're within parameters of each other, but there's a correct angle to your shoulder, how they fasten behind you, how they fasten to the floor. Is the proper washer being used if it's just going on sheet metal? If it's going through a boxed member, you don't want the bolt without a spacer. Otherwise, it'll just continue to crush. It's never tight. It's a problem you find more and more. Cars are constantly being bought and sold, and you'll see a lot of them race ready. I just finished the event. Race ready means get ready for a full restoration. We've done a few, I think. It's you know, not all, but most of the cars, that's what happens. Yes. The bushing, there's 2 ways of doing it. Well, just cutting it on a saw, chop saw, whatever it means. I'm not going to get into the whole thing of how to build a race car, but this is an example of, this side was machined on a lathe. This side wasn't. It was just saw cut. So if you just saw cut it and put it in there, it's still not straight. Machined, it'll fit in there properly, it'll tighten, it applies force evenly. About 12, 15 years ago, the Society of Automotive Engineers did a study on upfitters in the automotive and the truck industry. And what they found was when a hole is drilled through a frame and then there's a burr that's left, later on, if you'd like to walk around and look at it, you'll see it. A burr is left. When you put the bolt in there and tighten it without removing that burr, the study showed that 30 to 50% of the surface area isn't being used anymore because that burr is holding it from having direct contact with whatever component is supposed to be bolted to the frame. So they came out, Things should be deburred, countersunk. This was not. Poor fitment of parts. You could buy the best parts, but you still need to be fitted to a car. If you don't fit them right, well, it's kind of going to work. And kind of isn't acceptable when safety comes in. I'm sure you walked around, a lot of the cars, we've been questioned on. Questioning, they never looked like that when Lotus built that. Lotus 18 is a perfect example. They never shined. Well, it's shiny, but it's not shiny because we like to make things shiny. It's shiny because things were inspected. Things were, control arms that were repaired multiple times are not acceptable. You can only weld something. You should weld it once, not keep welding. If you keep welding it, it broke for a reason, and it's stress. And the cars keep getting older. I don't want to repeat myself, but they are getting older, and metal fatigue does settle in. And as Mike said, we're getting faster as well. Lap times keep coming down. It's obvious. So, back to the Lotus. It looks shiny. Well, for two reasons. You keep it shiny so you can see it. A dirty, greasy frame will hide cracks all day long. You don't know what component is going to fall off. On the racetrack, we've seen exhaust systems. We've seen suspension components. Last year, a tie rod failed at Pocono on a car. And he was walking around, the driver was walking around the pits looking for a tie rod. He had the ball in one hand and the housing in the other. That is not acceptable. That'll kill you. And it's not just about yourself, it's about all of us. And that's, it's a gray area. People love to drill holes in them and put grease fittings in them. Well, you took the play out of it, but that grease doesn't replace the metal that's just worn out of it. So attention to detail, not just in keeping the cars clean, but ultimately you keep them clean to keep them safe, to find problems, and they don't last forever. Sterling Moss, in an interview, which I hate to say is on Facebook, that comes from YouTube, and he was interviewed sitting in a Lotus 18 Formula One car he won in 1961, I believe, Monaco Grand Prix in. And in the interview, he says they were rather fragile when the rear wheels had a tendency to pass you. So they broke then. They're what, 57, 58 years old, I guess the cars now? The cars go from the racetrack to the shop. On jack stands, lift, strip them down. We don't remove every single component. Take the body panels off, take the wheels off, inspect the welds. You have to look. When you look around the racetrack and in the pits, and people are trying to prep a car for an event, and they're struggling. Why? Because you don't have your tools. You don't have the means to fix a car properly. So now it's overlooked. It may be okay, goes on the track. The next race, it just goes to the next race, and on and on and on. Problems continue to arise. What else?
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
How do you get that pushing in there?
You cut the frame open.
If you make the hole big enough, we usually leave it small on one end, or make the bushing longer. Machine it on both sides and weld it on the outside.
I mean, you wouldn't put another hole and slide it up, or?
No, you don't want to take away from the frame any more than it is. And it's regardless of what you're mounting to the frame. It's your seat. The seats usually get drilled through the top. Well, the seat needs to be planted pretty solidly in a car. Put a bushing in it. You can't stress that enough in the cars. And it's been overlooked. And I don't want to say all the cars are that way. Cars that we've seen, and we've had quite a few over the years. And we have a car we're in the middle of restoring now. 2 shocks are totally blown. It was raced twice. Left front suspension totally locked up. Race ready. Guess it didn't handle very well, but we won't look back. New shocks are going on. And why was the suspension locked up? Because the bushings weren't machined correctly. the shoulder of a bolt. Wrong length, tighten it up. It takes all the play out of it. It feels great. The next time you either do a nut and bolt inspection, over tighten it, it locked up. It shouldn't be that way. We fit each bolt to each suspension component. Each bushing, if it's too long, too much play, reduce it. Well, we don't go on a bench grinder. We only have a few lathes in the shop, but you use the lathe, you reduce it. If a shim needs to be ground, you grind it to size. It has to fit properly, it has to be tight. Use good quality fasteners, grade 8 or aircraft quality bolts, even better yet. You can order them with the shank by the 16th usually, is your best bet. Reusing old bolts on old cars, British metallurgy wasn't that great. And let me tell you, you still find quite a few of it on cars. It leaves a lot to be desired. What the threads do, besides fasten, when a bolt has threads with no shank and it's going through, all it's going to do is wear. The threads want a shank. You have a little area that's threaded, the shank. The shank should be taking the load. It won't wear. With time they do, but when a bolt is being asked to be the pivot point, as in the case of this component here, everything just wore out. This hole in the fulcrum is so oblonged, it's destroyed. Yes. Could you weld it up? You can. Is it worth it? No. They're available, or we make them new. There's very little material left in it. Sometimes you see sleeves done.
You were starting with a fresh bolt there. Could
You can put a sleeve in it. Sometimes we do, or use shouldered bolts. I mean, this is for a clutch mechanism on an Austin Healey. You lose the clutch, well, all right, you can probably still shift it without the clutch. You're not going to take off very well with it, but it's always a safety issue. You find it in carburetor arms, on the carburetors themselves, worn. Healey's or SU carburetors have a small spring plate in them that act as a clamp. Garbage. We just scrapped another set. They will not stay tight. The small screw is maybe 3 millimeters. Improvements, but yet try not to take away from the authenticity of the car. We get into the electrical components. Boots, yes. Anything that's, whether it's positive ground or negative ground system, the unearthed cable must be booted. Behind most of the switches, it's not. This is the example of a booted switch. Battery, just a positive, or again, the unearthed ground needs to be booted. The starter as well, the starter terminal. If a remote solenoid is being used, it needs to be booted. Safety switches for fuel pumps. Most cars, you turn on the main switch, turn on the ignition switch, turn on the fuel pump switch. A fuel pump is running constantly. What happens when you hit the wall and you're unconscious? Who's going to shut the pump off for you? Oil pressure will. Safety switch. We used to have a bypass switch in the cars. We have eliminated those. You can override the switch, the oil pressure switch, with a dashboard switch. Prime the system, start the car. Forget to turn that switch off, you just bypass this. Does you no good to have it in the car. 3 terminal switches take a starter terminal. The starter is activated, the fuel pump runs, primes the system for you, it fires. Not a VSCCA requirement, SVRI, VRG, absolutely. Good system to have. Besides the oil pressure activated switches, there's an inertia switch that's available. We prefer not to use them. Then you can go back to your regular fuel pump switch. The inertia switch relies on impact. It throws a ball, opens the contacts, fuel pump is off. When we get into fuel lines, braided lines are great. Who likes them, who doesn't? But they need to be assembled properly. This is not. A hose clamp on a hose that was designed to have a fitting. During a tech inspection, I'll look the other way. You check for leaks. I like to touch things. That's what I do. My hands get dirty. I touch. I look for fuel leaks at a tech inspection. Oil lines done this way. They don't last. Do it properly. Use the right fitting. The problem is, when it comes into using the right fitting, when you cut the hose, it's usually taped. Well, they fray. In order to eliminate it from fraying, you leave the tape. This is an example of the tape being left on the fitting and then screwed on. Now the tape is making the connection between the fitting and the hose. When it gets saturated in fuel and oil, which it will, you lose the mechanical connection between the hose and the fitting that it's supposed to be doing. Can you see this doing a tech inspection? Usually not. The tape is hidden. You find it when you take things apart to replace it, or to get rid of the red and blue fittings. Earlier I told the story. Years ago, it was the first car, the Austin Healey. We went to the VSCCA spring meets. We had the car sorted, fresh engine, all new fuel lines, oil lines. Many VSCCA members gathered around the car, and God rest his soul, Frank Rigetti looked at it. He dropped a few obscenities and said, "It looks like a Christmas tree under here, fellas." And Bob and I looked at each other, and I said, "Well," and Bob kept nudging me, "Be quiet." I didn't know who Frank was. So I kept talking, and he said, telling me, "Be quiet." Finally, he pulled me aside and said, "You know who he is?" I said, "No." He said, "That's Frank." He says, "He gives out the numbers. If you're looking for a number for your own car, not a good idea to be on his bad side." So anyhow, next race we went back. Didn't look like a Christmas tree anymore. So we don't use red and blue fittings. Feel free to strip them, buy nickel plated. They're even available in black. Regardless of the color, it makes just use the proper connections. Plumbing fittings. A lot of areas you just can't avoid it. There's pipe thread. Pipe thread with dope wrapped around them. Unfortunately, we've seen it even used on brake calipers. That is absolutely a no-no. Brake calipers, any brake component, does not use Teflon tape. It uses an O-ring washer, or it uses a tapered seat, or it's flared. Regardless of the connection, Teflon tape does not belong on brake fittings going into a caliper. Oil filter should be safety wired. SVRA requires it. Whether you put a hose clamp around an oil filter, or we use a cushion clamp and then attach it to something. Oil filters only come loose when they're left loose. Everybody drives a car probably to work or around every day, has a spin-on oil filter. If you leave it loose, it will fall off. We've seen it on the track. It does happen. It gets ugly. But SVRA, it's a requirement again. Safety wire it. If it's tightened properly, it's not going anywhere. Put the safety wire on it. It satisfies their needs. Safer for everyone. Kingpins, ball joints. A ball joint's no different than a tie rod. It will fall apart. If it has play, replace it. Don't wait. Well, the manufacturer's 100 thousandths it's allowed to have, or 50 thousandths worth of play. It has play. Replace it. It's on a race car. The argument always comes, I'm just doing VSCCA events. I'm only driving the car at my controlled pace. Yes, but you're not the only one out there. If it's just you and you choose to run on components that are loose, worn, gonna fail, sorry for you, I guess. It's not just about one car. It's about multiple cars. We'll keep the joints in proper condition. And like I said, even a ball joint, greasing it, once it's loose, just greasing it doesn't renew it. Packs more grease in it, takes the play out of it. Nobody's gonna feel it. A tech inspection We do them in 10, 15 minutes. We'll go through a tech inspection. Usually that's what it takes. The car passes tech. How safe is it though? We don't know the car didn't go on a lift. The switch. How many cars actually shut off with the switch? Alternators love keeping them running. Back feed into it, car stays running. Some people believe it's just there to disconnect the switch, the battery from the starter. It's supposed to kill the whole car, everything. Ignition shuts down, fuel pump shut down. It shouldn't backfeed into it and keep the motor running. MSD loves to do it. They can be a real pain in the ass to shut down. Alternators, MSD, and a switch make fun wiring situation. But it's a requirement. It's a requirement that the car shuts down. That's the first thing SVRA does. If the tech inspector doesn't reach the switch first, he might ask you to do it. Prior to that, they'll check the brake lights. If they're not bright enough, there is a requirement on brake lights. Some clubs say only one. We prefer to run with two. 15 watt, I believe, is the minimum. Might even be 25 watt. 2 bulbs will produce that kind of wattage. So once you pass an SVRA tech inspection, that's the preliminary. They'll look at your helmet. I'm not going to get into helmets, driving suits, gloves. That's a driver's responsibility as far as I'm concerned. But yes, they will, SVRA checks them, checks socks, your underwear, your blockavia, gloves, what else? Shoes. Are the laces frayed? Are the shoes in good condition? If they don't like them, forget it. You're not getting through there. Important, keep good shoes. It's very important. Wear the proper arm restraints, open wheel. A lot of times, are they sewed on? Are they clamp on tight? Whatever you prefer to use. But arm restraints, they're not in the car. You're not passing tech.
And wear them.
And need to be worn. Get into Hans devices. Well, whether it's Hans, I don't even know all the manufacturers, and I won't get into that. Regardless, the seat belts need to be mounted properly for it. If the spread is too great, they want 3 inches maximum spread on your shoulder belts. It'll slip off your shoulder. It's not going to do you any good if it slips off your shoulder. It's there to protect you. We don't mandate them in VSCCA. I believe it's going to come. One of these days, it's going to be a requirement. But at least make sure that the seat belts are mounted properly and at the proper angle. If it's not at the proper angle, all it's going to do is break your collarbones, regardless. And it won't hold you in there if they're not at the right angle. What are they mounted to? If it's just going through a roll bar, it's a tube. A tube is no different, whether it's round or square, still needs a bushing. We weld bushings into the roll bars, if that's where it's being attached to, and it's bolted in with the proper bolt. Proper dimension of bolt, proper grade bolt. Likewise on the floor. You can use the hooks. If you use hooks on seat belts, they need to be pinned or safety wired. The loop type belts love to slip on roll bars. They need collars of some sort. Roll bar padding is acceptable, taped on to act as a spacer and to keep the belts from sliding. If the belts slide off, it's coming off your shoulder, you're not staying in the car.
Do you use heim joints in your roll bars?
In the roll bars, we don't use heim joints. We just,
What's the question?
do we use heim joints in the roll bars? If you do, a lot of times up top, it's common to see on a roll bar with a single arm going back, the angle of that roll bar is important as well. There's ruling on that. If it's too flat, it's not going to work. If it's upright too much, it doesn't work neither. It'll still fold over on impact, on rollover. Needs to be pinned. We safety wire them as well. All heim joints, captive washers, each side. It has to be retained. If it's going in between a fulcrum, it's fine. No captive washers necessary. If it's on the outside with just the bolt going through it and it's mounted to the chassis, it needs a captive washer. Reason being, the ball pops out, the arm, the outer housing slides over the ball. It's now your suspension, roll bar, whatever component of the car you're using it for, even throttle linkage. Now it becomes a safety issue, and it's not going to end well if suspension components are falling off of the cars. Push rods on master cylinders. We've seen them break. Why did they break? Well, it was welded to, all thread, common used. Find it at the hardware store. We've seen all thread welded to them, offsets created. Instead of the push rod being threaded one piece with a ball machined at the end of it, people choose to cut them, weld them together. Well, you just destroyed the metallurgy of that bolt, the integrity of that bolt, of that push rod. You're exerting a great deal of force on that. It was at a vintage rally, actually, a hill climb, that we saw one fail. And it was manufactured wrong, or fabricated wrong. We've seen push rods. This is an example. This one was done right. The tubing's thick enough. It's just old steel that's been through many paces. Anyhow, it's threaded. The tie rod, or heim joint, rose joint, whatever you prefer to call it, rod end, threads in with a counter nut. Most of the time, the nut's welded to a piece of tubing. It's nice and light, thin wall tubing, weld the nut to it. Then it's proceeded to go over to a grinder and grind the weld away, make it look pretty. Now you have nothing left. Not how it's done. Thread the tubing, screw it in, tighten it, use good quality tubing. When you get into even the roll bars, welded tubing is acceptable in vintage racing. Unfortunately, why they accept it, I don't know. Should be only DOM or chromoly 4130, 4140 tubing being used on roll bars. But welded tubing is acceptable. Some of the cars, you would think it's not even electrical tubing. I don't know. Very thin wall, it's common. Exhaust tubing has been used on roll bars. That's why SVRA mandates that tube be drilled. They want to see the thickness of it.
Should it say welding, ERW tubing as opposed to confusing people for welding?
Yes, yes.
Together.
Electric welded tubing is, when in the process of manufacturing, the tube is formed and it's welded. There's a seam. A lot of times when you bend that tube, especially if that seam now is on the outside, you're asking that tube to stretch, that seam will crack. It spreads open. If you don't see the crack in the process of bending the tube, it doesn't mean it's not fractured. Chromoly is seamless tubing. There's welded tubing that's also DOM. DOM, drawn over mandrel, high quality steel. The weld you will not find if there is a weld. Most of it isn't, it's seamless. The fitting of two components of tubes on roll bars, that really opens up a real can of worms, let me tell you. You have two tubes that have to meet. It's coped. Whatever version you prefer. We'll machine the cope, put the tube together, and it's TIG welded. We've seen welds on cars that are just, are you kidding? It's not acceptable. We need to up our standards. It will not hold. It's going to fail. You see roll bars that have been welded. Rich and I, 2 years ago, went to go look at a Corvette. SCCA car, raced for years with SVRA actually. Had a full roll cage. The car had been sitting for years in a garage, then outside. So he says, you know, let's look at it, see if this car is actually worth purchasing. I said, all right, the simplest way is we're gonna do a tech inspection. We'll start with the roll bar. Well, looking at the roll bar, beautiful big tubes, 2.5 inches in diameter. Lots of them, going all different directions. Well, they were more interested in the appearance of the roll bar than the functionality of it. What they proceeded to do was they coped everything. They fitted it up after welding. I guess they didn't get it right once, so they welded it again. Then they took the grinder and started grinding away. We found 4 cracks, some of them up to 2 inches long, because the material was all ground away. There was no weld material. There was no base material left. It was a pile of scrap, yet it had tech inspection stickers on it. They were old. The car hadn't been ran in over 15 years. Regardless, that work wasn't done afterwards. It was like that. You don't grind the welds. If you didn't get it right, then remove that weld. If the piece doesn't fit right and has a big gap, weld is not base material. You don't just keep adding more to it. Fit the part properly, weld it properly. Preferred, TIG weld it. It takes longer. It's not as quick as MIG welding. MIG welding is simple. Open up the bottle if you have it with argon gas. If not, you can even go with flux wire. Makes a hell of a mess, but it's acceptable means of welding. You'll find them in most people's garages. Great. Most of the welds fail. Most of the welds, they're supposed to be proper looking in appearance. You could tell a lot in a MIG weld. Most of the MIG welds don't hold on cars. Weren't done right. A lot of material, or like the industry likes to call it, a lot of popcorn. Porosity in the weld. They forgot to turn on the gas. We continue to put the bead down. You did nothing to join that properly together. But it's on there. And it's on there. It's basically, you should have taken Elmer's glue and glued the thing together, because the integrity is not there. And it's common to see. MIG welding is one of the it was designed to be a quick way of welding rather than the old school of arc welding. But it'll disguise a good weld any day of the week. TIG welding leaves no room for error. After a TIG weld, you can look at it. Austin Healey frames, they were all stick welded. There's even evidence of splatter still. If the slag contaminated that weld, it's obvious. You would see it. Matter of fact, there's evidence of it in the corners. But that's how they did it in the day. Down here, they never even got it. Go down pit lane, and you can learn a lot. One area is, there's 5 minutes to go, and cars are still coming up to the false grid. You qualified third, but you're the last one to get there. Now you want your third spot. Well, cars are now starting to be, they're running, they're getting hot, waiting to go, and the grid has to stop and wait for, please. SVRA just mandated, you show up within that, when the 5 minute warning is given, you show up to the false grid, you start from the back. It's simple. It cuts down on the chaos. Now you have a car coming down, cars are trying to leave, who stalls, who's trying to go around who, crew members out there trying to push start cars, who trips, who falls, who's going to get run over, who's getting frustrated. Engines are overheating. We had 2 engines. We're not blaming on the false grid, but that's where it did start. No, it's not your fault in any way.
Oh, no, we want to
We had
rule and block the entrance.
perfect. I agree. 5 minutes to go. We'll wait. 3 minutes. Fire the engine up. No coolant fan. We're waiting. The temperature starts rising. Now you have an issue that arises of things being delayed. Well, engine goes back for a rebuild. Our engine builder says, you keep overheating the engine. No, we don't. We run at 180. Every time. At no more than 180. On the track, it's at 180. False grid, we've seen temps of 220, 230. You're sitting there being held because of chaos going on. The chaos is killing engines. Now they start overheating. You drop coolant. Now, you wanted to race. Well, you're not going anywhere. You're going to get a whistle. They're going to point it. They're going to see something leaking from your car. You're done. Get it back. Well, is it a matter of getting it back out or not? The false grid needs to run smoothly. And it's not running smoothly because people, I believe, are not showing up on time. Get there early, get staged. It's nice, calm. Trying to keep the cars original and safe. Clash. Yes, the roll bars can't be with multiple tubings. No door bars. Well, unfortunately, a door bar might save you. If a door bar is kept discreet enough, keep it below the belt line, it's gonna help. It doesn't take away from the car. It's been a fine line of original, nostalgic, vintage, or is it safe?
The whole goal of this talk was making those old cars safe. And I think most of us will look the other way if there's an extra sidebar, you know, or a bar under the dashboard to protect the driver, because, you know, certainly the thing I like most about the VSCCA is it's the safest place I drive. Of all the clubs I drive with, you guys are the guys that I'm happiest to drive with, because I feel like we all respect each other and we all pay attention to each other's cars. It's not like that in a lot of other groups, it makes it the most fun for me. But nonetheless, we're still going faster in the VSCCA. I mean, I don't even know if that would be competitive anymore. I watch Rich go around. Rich, what are you doing now at Line Rock? The best I ever did in that car was 110 and around Line Rock. So it just keeps getting faster. So I think we have to keep getting safer.